a moderator, but not moderating a whole lot really. But I am here today with you. I am employed by Garfield Park Neighborhood Association. And because of that employment, I have been appointed to the South Division Granville Corridor Improvement Authority Board. And it is that entity, the Corridor Improvement Authority, that is sponsoring this virtual event to have this discussion about our unhoused community. I have, and I hope to kind of insert those hopes into this event of a couple of outcomes. One, that we develop a fully recognize that there is an unembraced and an unrecognized component of our community, and that is our unhoused. My second hope is that we initiate a dialogue that recognizes the humanity and the citizenship of the unhoused in our community. I would like now to take an opportunity to introduce you all to our panelists. Each panelist brings a unique perspective and an expertise into the development of practices and programming for our unhoused community. We have Daniel Drent, Vera Beach, John Glover, Andrew Bifulco, and Ryan Kirkpatrick. Daniel, we have a little bit more information about him that will pop up shortly. Daniel's a community activist. He's passionate about food justice and fighting for food equity. He's a 2020 Dwelling Place Larry Bratshee Award winner. He's a Downtown Neighbor Network Board member and a DGRI Alliance member. We are honored to have Daniel with us today. Our next presenter is Vera Beach. Vera, many of you will know, is the CEO of Community Rebuilders. She has 20+ years of nonprofit management experience. Her focus is on providing services that are housing focused, consumer driven, strength based, and ultimately lower cost. She is an advocate for housing first policies that respect the rights of persons experiencing homelessness. She works to ensure that people her organization serves have unfettered access to safe and affordable housing. In 2020, Vera's stewardship of Community Rebuilders resources enabled the organization to assist 1,777 Kent County residents, including 819 children and 307 veterans to secure a place to call home. Our next presenter is John Glover. John Glover is Executive Director of Well House. He served as the director of the Open Door at Fort Street Presbyterian Church in Detroit prior to moving to Grand Rapids. John has an open door and multi-service program for the unhoused and vulnerable. He has worked several decades of experience in policy, administration, and direct services arenas, tackling a broad range of issues from health, hunger, and homelessness. We are honored to have John join us this panel today. Our next presenter is Andrew Buffulko. Andrew is a master's in architecture student at Kendall School of Art and Design. Andrew is passionate about food justice and transit equity. That is what got him into architecture in the first place. Since living and working in Detroit, he has been interested in the historical toll that so-called progress has had on the resiliency of established communities. He continues to explore what the discourse of architecture can or should do to bring about a more just future. Welcome, Andrew. Our next presenter today is Ryan Kilpatrick. And Ryan is Executive Director of Housing Next. He has a background in economic development, affordable housing, community redesign, and public finance. Ryan has helped to define access to housing as a core economic development issue for West Michigan through data-oriented dialogue and partnership with employers, local municipalities, chambers of commerce, and developers. We are as well honored to have Ryan on our panel today. I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping issues with you before we get started. I want to let you all know and remind you yet again that we are being recorded. If you select to be an anonymous participant in this event, please go to the chat for instructions as to how to make that happen effectively. Each panelist will have 10 minutes for their presentation. While presenting, we ask that you all populate your questions in the chat. At the end of all of this, I will go to the chat and read out the questions that remain that have not yet been addressed by our panelists. I think I've covered everything I need to cover, and I think we're ready to seriously rock and roll. I'm turning it over to you, Daniel. Knock 'em dead.
Thank you, Fran. I appreciate everybody joining us today. This is a topic that hits home to me. I spent a majority of the time from 2012 to 2015 unhoused until I found permanent housing. So I'm aware of the struggles and the difficulties that people encounter when trying to go from unhoused to housed. There have been some changes for the good since during my time that I've been housed. That's making it a little bit easier, but just want to kind of talk about some of the struggles, perceptions, and things that people might not necessarily be aware of. I guess the first thing is the perception of unhoused or homeless, that everybody's a drug addict or an alcoholic or mentally unstable, that there's something wrong with them. First of all, none of those things mean that there's anything wrong with you. You're just dealing with some issues that we all have to deal with in our life. But people are homeless for a lot of reasons. People are homeless or unhoused due to circumstances, whether it's a loss of job, they lost their home, either through financial difficulties or through some type of disaster. There are people who are unhoused and homeless because of mental illness. There are people who are dealing with drug addiction or alcoholism or some other type of addiction. There are people who are dealing with the issues of former criminal activities that they had, whether it would be just unable to find housing because of their criminal record or because of limitations on housing due to probation status or restrictions on where they can live. And then you do have a group of people who are homeless just because they want to be homeless. They don't want to deal with the hassle of day-to-day life that it requires when you live at home. So I think it's important to group together or to understand that not everybody is homeless for the same reason, and you can be homeless for multiple reasons. It's not just one or the other either, so they can carry over. I guess the other thing that I want to let people know is that when you see what you perceived as being homeless or unhoused, quite often people are upset because of the things that are going on that may not be conducive to what you want in your neighborhood or what you deem as being acceptable behavior. Do not automatically assume that all those people are unhoused or homeless. Quite often, people who have homes mix into that population for multiple reasons. But it's not necessarily, when you see that cluster of people, everybody there is experiencing homelessness or being unhoused. So I guess I want to talk about a little bit about some of the difficulties. Grand Rapids is a great city. People care a lot. Lots of checks are written. But that's part of the problem, is a lot of people write checks, but then they don't do anything else. So it's getting better, but it's difficult to navigate that path to try to find a home and how to do it. You may have to talk to different organizations. You have to go to different meetings. You have to go to one place to another. You have to get put on waiting lists and hope that you hear back. And all that is really difficult if you're unhoused. If you don't have an address, if you don't have a phone, if you don't have reliable transportation, if you don't have a reliable mail address to receive that information, you can fall through the cracks really quick. And sometimes that information, when it comes to you, you may have a matter of days that you need to respond. And if you don't find out until too late, they've moved to the next person on the list, and then you fall to the bottom of the list. So it can get very frustrating. Some of the other things, and this is not the case for everybody, but most of our organizations, or a large percent of our organizations, are faith-based, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, if you are not a person of faith, or you're not a Christian, sometimes people have felt unwanted or unwelcome to go to those places. And they feel that they're being judged, or that they may be left out. And that also can require, go to people of color, or sexual orientation, or gender identity, where they sometimes don't feel comfortable going to those places, as they may be judged or feel that they're not welcome. Again, I think this is improving greatly, but in the past, it certainly has been an issue that has had to be dealt with. The other thing is with housing. It's difficult if you don't have an income. How are you going to pay your rent? It's difficult to find those sources. It's difficult if you're trying to apply for benefits, to have the ability to fill out all the applications, to be able to get assistance with that, to understand it. And it even becomes more difficult if you're trying to add in the fact that you're maybe trying to get federal assistance through disability, or state benefits for disability, and that type of stuff. All that stuff starts adding an extra challenge and an extra step that you keep on having to do. And it's more paperwork, and it's more of this, and more meetings and people you need to meet with. And it sometimes can get really, really frustrating. I know for myself that frustrated with not finding housing and everything, in suffering with depression and anxiety, it gets really, really tough. And I finally had to take it upon myself that I kind of took it as my full-time job. And I spent every single day doing nothing but figuring out and working with people, both for housing and to be able to get my disability. And that's what it takes. Nobody's just going to hand it to you. And sometimes that's what people want, or people think. And I think that's the message that we need to also get across to people, is that this is not a handout. You have to work for it, and you have to want it to make it happen. Another thing that sometimes people struggle with when they're trying to go from unhoused to housing is that a lot of our affordable housing has rules and regulations, which that life has rules and regulations, but people don't want to necessarily move into a place where they are told how many guests they can have, or what time their guests can be there, and who or what their guests can be, so on and so forth. A lot of those restrictions are put in place for very good reasons, but at the same time, a lot of people may struggle with that type of thing. I'm assuming that's my 2-minute warning. So
it's not, but it is your 2-minute warning, just so you know.
All right, thank you. So I guess I just want to wrap it up with that, you know, we need to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture and looking at each person individually and figure out the best way to work with them. And that's part of what we're trying to do with this meeting. That's part of what we're doing with the Heartside Downtown Neighborhood Association, is making sure that all people's voices are heard and recognized, including our unhoused neighbors. So I will wrap it up with that, and we can go on to the next speaker. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Hello, everyone. And Danielle, I just want to thank you for that sharing of that experience, because those are so many of the things that we hear on a regular basis. So thank you for sharing that. Many people say that Community Rebuilders has a unique approach to addressing homelessness. And unfortunately, this is true. At Community Rebuilders, every intervention needs to be a housing intervention. And this just simply isn't true across all homeless services in our community. All services provided do not lead to housing stability. And without that focus on affordable housing, our community has a way for people to flow into homelessness. We have ways to support them while they're experiencing it, but we have no way to help them flow out of the homeless experience. People often end up on a wait list to nowhere or in and out of a shelter. And often their health condition worsens, and the impact is really devastating for our community members. Some studies estimate that 20 years of life expectancy is lost because of chronic homelessness. When addressing homelessness, we focus on housing first, because it's consistent with what people who are living in places unfit for human habitation and on the street want most, a place to call home. We also believe if we want to be serious about ending homelessness as a community, it will take an effort that is coordinated and committed to evidence-based practices. Practices such as low barrier emergency accommodations, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. We must also commit to using data and outcome to inform our investments. We must focus not on the tradition of what has always been done or what our heart might think is best, but really think about those evidence-based practices and be driven by the persons who are experiencing the homeless crisis when we make decisions. I want you just to consider for a minute some of the data we know about Kent County. And for this discussion, I ask you to consider the 2019 and 20 point in time count provided by HUD by our local continuum of care. The PIT count, as it is called, is a snapshot of how many homeless individuals are in Grand Rapids on the same night each year, which offers a consistent year-over-year measure. In the 2019 point in time count, 759 persons were identified as literally homeless. And in 2020, that count rose to 923. Even with numbers like that, if we focused our collective effort on housing these 923 people, I believe we could get it done. You know, I often hear people ask, do we have the will to end homelessness in Kent County? I wish they would ask a more pointed question or questions. Do we have the commitment to change old models and invest in results? Will we take a right-based approach and believe that everyone truly deserves a safe place to call home? And do we believe that with the right supports, despite experiencing homelessness, our neighbors without a home will be able to achieve housing stability? Will we use numbers and data to support our fundraising efforts? Or will we use numbers to create a by name list of persons experiencing homelessness and work to house every single person on that list? That is what we did in Kent County to make veteran homelessness rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. Will we take proven models like this and solve homelessness for all populations? Or are we going to simply expect that people put their life together at a time when they don't have control over where and when they sleep, when and what they eat, when they have time to relax, if they can come inside or if they have to go outside at a certain time of day, what belongings they can have with them, or if they can get to a public shower? I hope not. I hope we will create low barrier, immediate accommodations for those community members who don't have a place to call home. Places where they do have control over their time, their belongings, and their ability to come and go. A place where they can rest and actually focus on a housing plan. Low barrier shelter is an essential component of an effective system to end homelessness. We have very limited low barrier shelter accommodations in our community, but we have many shelter beds. We opened our Housing Connection Center model in 2018, and this low barrier shelter model that we call a place where innovation and collaboration collide provides a bridge to permanent housing. While staying there, people get a key to the building. They choose what to eat and when to eat. They choose when to come and go and when to sleep. And is essentially a bridge to housing that is just like being in your own home. The results are astounding. The length of stay compared to most emergency shelters is longer. People stay on an average of 49 days compared to a statewide average of 34 days. But 78% of the people who utilize those low barrier temporary accommodations exit to a permanent housing destination. Statewide, only 18% of the persons who use traditional shelter exit to permanent housing. It really does matter if we increase personal control, comfort, and safety, and allow people the time to focus on a housing plan versus their survival needs. So how do we help people move into housing? I said we focus on housing first. And we do that because we believe that homelessness is a crisis that can be addressed through safe and affordable housing. We believe that all persons experiencing homelessness, regardless of their history, regardless of income, regardless of incarcerations in the past or disabilities, can achieve permanent housing if they have the right supports. We must ensure that housing assistance is not conditioned on compliance with treatment programs or sobriety, or even we have some programs in our community where resources are given out based on how much volunteer time a person who's experiencing homelessness contributes. Things like that need to be addressed. We understand that the quality of life will improve once people are housed. Health, physical health, mental health, all improve once people are housed, and people are better able to access those services that they need to address those problems that may include, histories of incarceration and reintegration into the community or substance abuse use. We must rely on people's self-determination and their goals and their wants and dreams to set housing plans. We have to listen to them and understand the type of housing they want, and then configure our services to meet their needs. Providing rental assistance is key to this work, yet it is something that is very hard to sell in this community. Rental assistance can be short, long, or medium term, depending on the person's needs. And long-term assistance is really reserved for those persons with chronic homelessness or severe and persistent disabilities that really require some long-term financial and social supports to keep them stably housed. And just as you heard from Daniel, most people who need support getting into housing do not need it permanently. Most people who need support have had some kind of crisis in their life. Maybe they've lost a loved one. Maybe there was a health emergency. Maybe there's a medical issue that caused them to enter into homelessness. It could be as simple as loss of a job.
2-minute warning, Vera.
Thank you. When we provide that rental assistance, it can be set to a standard that is based on what each individual person needs. Recently, our geographically targeted outreach program, started with the city of Grand Rapids, has gotten a lot of attention. We invested in permanent housing in that effort, and people are taking notice because when 51 people are assisted to move from the streets to housing in one small geographic area, it's really noticeable. But keep in mind, we didn't outreach on the streets with tents and supplies to make people more comfortable on the streets. We outreached and provided access to housing. Our first contacts with folks in the area were to help them access that low barrier accommodation. And the first person who accessed that service was housed in a permanent unit within 20 days. 10 additional people have been housed since then, and we will continue to work with those households who are in our temporary accommodations to secure that long-term housing within the community. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's not easy. Just as you heard from Daniel, it is hard. There is rejection out there. There is negotiation that has to happen with landlords. There is all kinds of work that has to happen. And that's why we believe it's essential people have that temporary place to stay where they don't have to worry about their survival needs. We also know that we must invest in, as a community, in these kind of strategies. And so I ask, as you put your hearts and your energy into this work, that you will stay focused on housing as a solution, that you will think about best practices, not just locally, but nationally. You will look at the evidence and rely on the data. I also ask that you ask yourself, what type of accommodations and services would you want and need? Would you want help securing housing rapidly if you were homeless? I doubt you will say you wanted a tent or a portable potty or a special location where you can live in a tiny shed or encampment with others who are also experiencing homelessness.
Vera, time's
Think
up.
about what you want. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Andrew. And Andrew has some slides, Latricia, so if you could bring those up.
The next is John. John, you can go ahead and take the floor.
Okay. First, I want to echo Vera's gratitude to Daniel for sharing his lived experience. I know that can be hard, and I know that every time you have to do it, or every time you feel like you want to do it, that there's a cost to that, and I want to acknowledge that. I'm not surprised that Vera's presentation was chock full of statistics and really complicated scenarios, which allows me to be a little bit more of a user in my comments because she covered the gamut, which again, I'm not surprised. So thank you for that, Vera. For those of you who don't know much about House, I'll share that we are a low-income housing provider. We have 15 homes throughout the southeast section of Grand Rapids, providing permanent housing to 60 people. And to echo Vera's point, 60 people permanently housed has a dramatic effect on the communities in which these folks live. I'm happy to take specific questions about House later on during the Q&A, or offline if anyone wants to email me or call me. I'm certainly happy to have a conversation with anyone. So our mission, quite simply, is to expand, provide, and safeguard low-cost housing for vulnerable people. And as Daniel and Vera highlighted very eloquently, the conditions that vulnerable people face are complicated. And so I won't repeat some of what they've outlined. But I'll jump to the notion of expanding and safeguarding as a really complicated piece of the work that we do. For larger macroeconomic market forces and policy reasons, expanding housing can be really complicated, and safeguarding low-income housing in particular during a booming housing market can be quite challenging. So I'll leave that there because I think Ryan might touch on those points, and he certainly is more skilled at this than I am. Let me talk a little bit about my take on the two primary issues that Fran used to frame this discussion. The gap, which we're talking about trying to find ways to bridge, and innovation. First on the gap. For me, when we're having a conversation about bridging the gap between needs and resources, what we're really talking about is a discussion about implementation. I don't see the gap as a void, as an empty space. I see it as a place that holds something. And so it becomes important for me and us at Wellhouse to identify, at least in our minds, what sits in that gap. And recognizing that other people might identify other things that sit in the gap as more important. I'm not pretending that we're the absolute definers of this, but Daniel's comments and Vera's comments spoke to this. And in polite conversation, what we often do is we talk about compassion fatigue, and we talk about limited capacity. We talk about outcome shortfalls. And that is a tone and tenor that is legitimate for those who choose to employ it for a particular audience or for particular reasons. But when we're talking about gaps with an eye towards evolving new approaches that might mitigate outcome shortfalls, we're talking about those elements that create disproportionality, that challenge equity, particularly around issues of race, socioeconomic, and health concerns. And so I have to admit that what I see sitting in that gap is a little bit uglier and uncomfortable to call out, let alone have a lengthy conversation about it. What I see sitting in that gap, and others might frame it differently, is indifference. I see a disturbing degree of incompetence, and I see a willingness to accept less than effective approaches for varying reasons. And I wouldn't pretend that there's malice in any of this. It's just simply what I see, and oftentimes I'm talking about what I see in our work at Wellhouse, and it's really more of a mirror reflecting our capacities and our ability to be effective. I'm not presuming to judge any other organization or provider. So what sits in that gap between needs and resources is the important thing to try to grapple with if we want to have effective outcomes. So to the second piece for which Fran framed this conversation, innovation. To me, new ways of doing things are not really all that new. I'll use some examples about innovations that we've taken on at Wellhouse. So in the past 2 years, when we perform intake for applicants, we insist that applicants bring with them a self-selected support person that can engage with Wellhouse. And that's so that if there's an event or a crisis that overwhelms that particular tenant's housing stability, we have someone who's not stuck in the crisis who can help us navigate the issues to make sure that that individual stays housed. We know that a lot of individuals who we serve have burned bridges and don't have people in their life that they can bring to bear as a support person. So sometimes we'll find one for them. But what we've learned is that without that support piece, people with multiple difficulties, which Daniel outlined them, quite a few of them quite graphically, they experience challenges that can really disrupt their ability to hold on to housing, however much Wellhouse tries to make it stable. So we've incorporated that innovation in our approach. Another example of an innovation was during the height of the pandemic last year, March, April, when the pandemic hit. We quickly talked with our board members, our volunteers, our stakeholders, and our tenants, And we rolled out a project that we call Visiting Neighbors. And that project is designed to do a couple of things. It was designed to offer prepared catered meals, excellently catered meals, by the way, commercial for 2 spoons, caterer, to our tenants and our neighbors and community service providers, and for their families. So there was a family of 6, they got 6 prepared catered meals, along with a pantry box with shelf-stable food items for the rest of the week, and PPE and other supplies. And we did that for, we did 3 rounds of 6 weeks, and then we did 2 other weeks. So we did it for 18 weeks in a row. And you know, these new approaches have substantially allowed us to you know, keep our tenants stable, increase their responsiveness to our efforts to engage them, because they recognize that we understand that there are other needs and we're trying to address them. These approaches allows us to keep our tenants, neighbors, and the community at large hyper-focused on the pandemic itself. One thing that I'm particularly proud of.
2-minute warning, John.
Okay. One thing that I'm proud of is that while our houses sit in the 2 highest impacted zip codes, not a single one of our tenants has been infected with COVID. And so we do believe that the innovative approach that we've taken has assisted that. So now I'm going to start talking a little fast so I can finish my notes here. So I think most of us would agree that connecting or reconnecting vulnerable people to a responsive support person or system is not really new. You know, some of us call that a family and friends, right? So that's not a new thing. Likewise, engaging the community with food programs and basic supplies is not new. A lot of organizations and programs do it and do it really, really well. For us, these approaches are new. And so what we do is we try to use what should be ordinary engagement and use them as tools to address extraordinary situations, or at least what should be uncommon situations in our work, and with good measurable outcomes. We package that, and with pretty words, we tell our funders, look at this innovative approach, would you fund this for us, right? That's the dance that we all do, right? So the challenge here is to make a commitment to treat our people, our neighbors, our community members with dignity, and doing that while drilling down into addressing the needs that will effectively help these individuals with their long-term stability in housing. So in short, we have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to invite other people to hold us accountable as well, because without that external pressure, we get caught up in our own vortex and our own fog. And to, you know, while doing that, to create effective, cost-efficient, and scalable approaches that insist on a couple of things: respect. If we can't muster compassion, at the very least, we can muster respect as an unyielding element of what we require. Competency and implementation. And competency can be, you know, staff to program ratio. It could be, you know, skill sets. It could be any number of things. But we have to recognize that in order to do things effectively, you need to have the competency that goes along with it. And
Time's up, John.
Yeah, and we should insist on approaches that we should insist on resisting approaches, as Vera said, that we have recognized are not effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here on this panel. Speaking, thank you, Fran, for inviting me to share this project. And thank you, Dwelling Place, for making this all run so smoothly. I'll get right into it. Today, I will be presenting the speculative architectural project, Shelterama. The 2 most important functions of Shelterama are to provide a public space for the fulfillment of basic needs of the immediate unhoused population, and bring about awareness of issues of economic injustice. And then, so where we are situated, Shelterama was designed to be situated near the major intersection of Burton and Division, just north of Amy's Fashion and across the street from the historic movie house there. The site will reuse materials from the existing building as well as utilize the open space of the adjacent parking lot. Shelterama is inspired by various other niche museums in communities around the country and the world, such as the Toonseum in Pittsburgh, the Puppet Art Theater in Detroit, and the People's History Museum in the UK, just some examples. These exemplars are deeply rooted in their communities and offer deep historical context into a specific subject, as well as programs for neighborhood organizations and schools. The project is an imagined museum to the history of homelessness, both in our city and the world, while acting as a resource to the local unhoused community members. So this aerial is meant to illustrate the point that the project is situated within an active and bustling node along the division corridor, with nearby access to food and other goods and services. Also, this diagram shows that Shelterama will act to continue the street wall, which exists south of Burton Avenue, and help maintain that consistency in built form to the north. The ground floor plan shows the museum gallery space on the corner of Division and Quigley there on the northeast, and the vacant lot between Shelterama and the clothing store to the south being activated by new program of both public and internal amenities. Divided into zones of access, the public-facing aspect of the project is meant to be a staffed resource for the public to satisfy basic needs such as taking a shower, washing clothes, or charging a phone, while the private spaces would be for the administration of the gallery and its rotating exhibits. These public and private zones are further broken down into specific programmatic functions, such as the exhibit hall, as mentioned before, or gallery space, will provide an opportunity to showcase innovations in smaller scale shelters and other thought-provoking interventions. As an extension of the indoor gallery, the proving ground outside will be for the exhibition of larger scale designs and innovations in transitional as well as emergency housing. For example, the 3D printed concrete houses by Icon for Unhoused in Austin. Above the gallery is one of the most important spaces in the project. The library will be a public resource for practical needs of charging a phone or accessing the internet, as well as providing a place to build community through education into the fact that ours is a common struggle, no matter what level of economic or housing insecurity one is suffering from. Corporate foundations and philanthropic trusts are happy to dump millions of dollars into Band-Aid solutions so long as a tax structure favorable to the wealthy and the death of labor unions persists. A small public green space, or the Hill, will act as a natural respite from the noise and traffic of Division. The new structure will consist of 2 fully accessible shower rooms within the pavilion, with adjacent dressing rooms, and will be large enough to secure carts or other personal items while using the facilities. There are also multiple access points to the park behind, which prevent pinch points or the feeling of being trapped for those community members who may have experienced trauma. The central translucent screening provides a level of privacy while maintaining visual access for safety. Steps 1 and 2 of construction will involve removal of the existing cladding and deconstruction of the wood structure to be reused in the final design. Construction on a new steel and concrete structure will commence with the installation of an elevator and a framework for the new building's skin. This new skin will consist of kinetic architectural panels, which will allow the building to open up fully to the outside, blurring the idea of inside and out, shelter and unshelter. The recycled materials will also go into the construction of the new pavilion of shower rooms. The dynamic movement of the architectural skin, along with the colored transparent panels, will act to surprise and delight passersby, to draw interest and eventually raise awareness of issues being explored within the project. And finally, this study model invokes the drama of internal illumination, experienced through the seams in those moving panels, as seen from the outside at night. As a student architectural project, Shelterama is not intended to be a solution to all problems of housing inequality, but simply an exploration in the combining of typologies which already exist, such as the neighborhood museum, the basic needs shelter for those experiencing homelessness, and the subversive library, into something that inspires further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. 2 minutes early. We appreciate that. Ryan?
All right, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate the other panelists. My name is Ryan Kilpatrick. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Next. We serve to provide a detailed analysis of the amount of housing at each price point that's needed across the community, policy opportunities to make adjustments to provide for that housing, and then partnerships with both for-profit and nonprofit developers to ensure that the housing we need can be supplied in the marketplace. So, I think hearing all of these detailed stories and expositions from the other panelists is really important to understand why housing is so important to so many people across the community. My perspective is always a little bit more at the systems level, and the perspective of these other panelists is so important to tell the individual stories. So real briefly, I'm going to try to wrap up early so we've got more time for Q&A. I just want to talk about what we need in the system today. And so more recently, I've started to talk more and more about three primary objectives. Stability, ensuring that every household is stable in their housing situation. As Vera was talking about earlier, anytime we allow a family or an individual to fall into homelessness, the cost to our community is exponentially greater than it would have been if we had just stabilized them where they were. And so making sure that we are investing in housing stability, preserving existing affordable housing, and preserving places for people to stay where they are. So number one is stability. Number two is supply. One of the issues that we have in Grand Rapids and West Michigan more broadly is we have a lot of people moving into the city. And so in 2020, we conducted a housing needs assessment to try to identify just how much more housing supply do we need, and found that in the city of Grand Rapids alone, there was a need for more than 9,000 additional housing units. And on top of that, we had 63,000 households in Kent County broadly, roughly 23,000 households in Grand Rapids specifically, who are cost overburdened, meaning they were spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And so those two factors combined, the fact that we have 23,000 households in the city who are struggling to make rent, on top of a need for another 9,000 additional units, that's a recipe for more price increases. It means that prices are going to continue to go up until we're able to achieve a more balanced market. And so we've got to talk about opportunities to add more supply to the mix while we're simultaneously focused on providing stability for households who are already here. We can't have development that involves displacement, but we also can't prevent development from happening where we need it most. And lastly, so we've got stability, we've got supply, and the last one is subsidy. It's really important to recognize what the cost of construction is in today's market. It's extraordinarily expensive to build new buildings today. The price of lumber has gone up more than 220% in just the last 12 months. We've got a lack of labor supply in the marketplace. And so wherever we can, we want to use traditional market-based principles to build housing wherever we can. But we have to recognize that those who are most at risk and those with the least amount of income are not going to be able to pay the cost of a true market rate rent in today's economy. And so in order to save our costs in the long run, as Vera was talking about, our healthcare costs, our mental health costs, our child development costs, we need to be investing in housing subsidy on the front end. And that's going to look like a mix of things. It's going to sometimes be grant dollars. It's going to sometimes be low interest loans. It's going to be contributions of property. There are a lot of ways that we can do that, but we have the resources within the community one way or the other. And so what I want to leave you all with is if we can focus collectively, if we can all be talking about stability, supply, and subsidy simultaneously, and recognize that we need all three of those things in order for us to be successful. I think the more we have those conversations and we hold our leadership and we hold ourselves accountable to supporting all three of those things simultaneously, I think the further we can get down this road towards a balanced housing market and housing stability for everyone. Oh, one last thing I wanted to make sure that I said before I was done is I saw Salvador Lopez is on the call. I really want to lift up the Housing Stability Alliance and the work that they're doing to align a lot of our housing partners. If you're not engaged with that already, I really strongly encourage you to pay attention to the Housing Stability Alliance because I think as we talk about those who are unhoused in our community, there's a lot of opportunity to really make some big movements with that organization.
Great. Do you want to make sure that all of our speakers have your cameras on as we move into this last question and answer section? And Fran, do you have a question to start us off?
Opening the chat now to pull up the questions that might be there sent to me by Jess. I see one question here is how big a problem is Airbnb in our housing supply?
I'm going to try to take that anecdotally. I don't have great data on this, but we have been making some comparisons between Grand Rapids and other markets that are similar to ours. Airbnb is not a major factor. Outside of big events like Art Prize, occasional events that happen during the summertime, we don't have an extraordinary amount of demand in Grand Rapids for seasonal rentals. I'm sure that there are some, and those Airbnbs are displacing potential year-round renters. But when you compare us to cities like Nashville or Indianapolis or Denver, we don't have the same kind of demand for seasonal rentals and Airbnb units as those other cities do.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question that came up what would be ways to help instead of sending checks? So I guess the question is, what do we do instead of handing out money to people? Any panelists have a thought on that?
I guess I'll take a stab at that. I'm not saying sending checks is a bad thing because we need the money.
Yeah,
but,
money doesn't hurt.
But you have to do more than hand out that check or hand out that hot meal or hand out coats or whatever. You've got to be part of the solution. You can't just write that check or hand out that coat and say, I'm done, I helped, I'm solving the problem. It's not just a one-step method. You got to be part of the solution. You've got to be, if you're going to write that check, know what that check's going for, what it's going to do, and figure out how you can be the solution, not just the Band-Aid.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I would just add, if I might just add, don't underestimate the power of your voice to impact policy across our community. Just your investment in time spent here today. You've learned a lot of different things from all of the panelists, and I hope that you will use that to help support solutions and policies that really can reduce and end homelessness.
Well said, well said. We had something that you mentioned, Vera, was the concept of low barrier housing. Could you say more? Could the panel speak more to that and then give us some examples? Do we have such things here locally, and how much of it?
We do. So Community Rebuilders operates in a couple of ways to provide low barrier shelter. We did open our first low barrier single site shelter in 2018, pre-COVID, where we have the fortunate ability to house in 6 different rooms that can house basically one household in a room and have their own bathroom. And then there's a shared kitchen facility. And then we also have bridge housing within rental units across the community, where individuals are sharing a unit for a short period of time with others who are also working on a housing plan and searching for housing. We have at any given time between 15 to 30 of those units that are active in the community. A number of those are segmented off to provide services to veterans, and that's how they're funded. But the really key elements are that ability to have that place where you know you can come back to every day. You can come and go as you please. You can set your own timeline. And what people consistently say over and over again is, my gosh, I finally had time just to let my head rest for a minute, because we all underestimate the social challenges that people face on the street when they're fighting to survive every single day. It is incredibly difficult and more than many of us can imagine. And so just having that space where they know I'm not going to have to leave tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. or I don't have to get in a line to get a bed, those things are really important. And also the autonomy that they have to make decisions about what they eat. You know, when you don't have a place to call home, you don't have access to food security. You might have access to a meal if you get there on time. And it may be food you like, or maybe that you don't like, or food that fits your dietary needs or doesn't. So all of those things are really valuable to the people that we serve in those housing units. But they also have ownership over that space. So we don't have security. We don't have to invest in security. We've never had any problems in those units. It is really about everybody kind of respecting what they need to do and getting their work done. So you've got to have that philosophy of believing and trusting in the goodness of humankind, and that people are going to do the right thing. And we are not disappointed by that very often.
That's good. That's good to hear. Ryan, you had talked about the need for a coalition to be put together for zoning reform, tiny homes, ADUs, and middle density housing in advance of the master plan. Is that something you'd like to raise here? I guess somebody's heard you talk about it before.
Yes, thank you for raising it. Yeah, absolutely. So the idea here is, and this is how you get involved without necessarily having to write a check, is when we talk about policy, what we talk about is what are we allowing to occur in our neighborhoods? More than 80% of the zoned land in the city of Grand Rapids is set aside for single family homes. And it's difficult to build anything other than that. But single family homes are the most expensive housing product out there. It's a really important solution for a lot of people, and I don't want to downgrade the value of single family homes. But we also need other housing choices. We also need options like townhouses, like condominiums that can be either owned or rented as apartments, shared equity cooperatives, tiny homes. Those are all opportunities to house more people in our city. And so what we really need is for folks to get engaged and begin to think about what are the kinds of housing solutions that you're willing to accommodate in your neighborhood. Show up during the master plan engagement processes. Talk to your neighbors. I can't tell you how often we find neighbors who are adamantly opposed to anything other than single family homes in their neighborhood until they talk to one of their neighbors who's in favor of it. And the process of just having that conversation to talk about who lives there and how does that engage with the rest of the built fabric in the community tends to disarm people a little bit when they recognize that their old sort of stigmatized assumptions about what housing choice looks like and how it interacts within a neighborhood. Typically, if we can unpack some of those assumptions and destigmatize housing choice, it can make a really big difference in our neighborhoods and the number of choices that are available to people.
Destigmatize housing choice. That's a concept. Panel, what would be ways to help in simplify the process of finding housing? We heard from Daniel some struggles, and Vera mentioned too how difficult that can be. What can we do to make it a little easier?
The easiest thing is to go to the people that need the help. Don't make them come to you. You know, go to the shelters, go to the homeless camps, go to where they congregate, Heartside Park, the other areas in town, and reach out to them, and then have a place where you could meet with them in those areas. I mean, instead of having to get on the bus and go someplace, or having to walk someplace, it just, you know, go to them instead of them having to come to you would make a huge difference.
John mentioned the concept of having a sponsor, a person that works that to work right along with you, because I would imagine in the process of looking for housing, your inability, the housing provider's inability to contact you by, you know, sending you something in the mail or maybe calling you might be a problem. And so I'm wondering, do you think that concept is a little bit a wider range approach to using that concept would be helpful?
Fran, we use a very similar model. We use what we call kind of a housing navigator training that our employees utilize with consumers to really, you know, support them in their efforts. We also think it's really important for the people that we're serving to build those relationships with the landlords within our community. So educating and informing, if you have friends who are property owners, like educating them and letting them know that this is a great opportunity for them to keep their rental units full, but also an opportunity to really help have an impact in the community. So communicating with folks is really important. And then on the side of the persons who are seeking housing, you know, things like transportation assistance, those are really limited resources in our community. And so anytime that you're thinking about, you know, gosh, could I volunteer in Drive, or could I donate dollars to transportation? Those are all things that are really helpful for the person who's actually like hitting the road every day to really search and look for a property to rent.
Thank you for that. I've got a question here for you, Vera. You mentioned how that I'm reading here what it says. How many people were homeless in both the 2019 and the 2020 HUD numbers? They stated here 759 in 2019 and 923 in 2020. Is that accurate? Is that what you said?
Correct, in the PIC count.
That's pretty startling, isn't it?
It is, on any given night.
And I'm going to guess that number is actually low compared to what it actually is, because unfortunately, they can't reach everybody, or people don't respond. So that number is low compared to what the actual figures would be.
With the master plan process about to begin, followed by zoning policy, what changes to the current master plan would you recommend that will contribute to affordable housing and stability changes? Panel?
All right, I'm going to jump in on this one. So again, from my perspective, this is about allowing for more housing choice, allowing for more product types, setting up our neighborhoods to be willing to accept a variety of housing products, so that it's easier for our nonprofit partners to get involved in every neighborhood, to build the kinds of homes that Community Rebuilders is working on, the kinds that New Development Corporation is working on, the kinds that Link Up and ICCF are working on, that Well House is working on. Right now, not every neighborhood is reachable to all of our nonprofits. And I think through the master plan process, we need to think about how can we create more opportunity for those nonprofits to expand the great work that they're already doing? And how can we create opportunities for traditional homeowners to make investments in their own backyard, right? To think about, how do I add another dwelling unit to my own property to help house somebody else? Or if I'm a first-time home buyer, how do I add that secondary dwelling unit to help me pay for my mortgage, right? Those are all opportunities, but we've first got to set the policy in place that allows those things to happen.
Here's the question that's come up. What is being done in the greater Grand Rapids area to help with affordable house ownership versus rental? Are there programs for credit preparation, training on owning or caring for a home, services available to help with costs, or training on building equity and avoiding scams? So how best can we prepare folks for becoming home owners? Is the essence of that question. Panel?
I think one of the best organizations that you can outreach to on that, who is doing really good work, is Link Up. They are really committed to pursuing and helping people pursue home ownership, and they're a great place. And ICCF and does some of that, as well as Habitat. But for me, my first go-to is always Link Up in that area.
There are a lot of small policies that combine together to make a difference. It's being said. The master plan will be a big one. Looking for economic development policies of the city of Grand Rapids is another. It's said here, I think another community practice would be to support and encouraging others to support organizations like Community Rebuilders. So you got kudos on your program here in our comments. That route with their efforts and best practices around addressing homelessness, rather than organizations that simply provide short-term shelter for people who need it. So kudos to you for the work that you're doing. See what we got here. Anything else that we haven't covered in our questions? Looking through here. City is selling a number of properties, parking lots. How do we require affordable units owned and rented into these properties? And then how do we define affordable? So I guess there's two questions there. City's got properties. How do we insert our thinking into having affordable housing on these properties, and how do we define what's affordable? Panel?
Well, I would say first, we've got a first ward commissioner on the call today. So if you don't know your commissioner, get to know them and advocate. Second, so defining affordable is one thing. And the other is defining how do we finance new development on those parking lots? Like, where do the dollars come from? And in order to do that, we really need to understand what's the cost of construction and what can we realistically achieve with the amount of funding that we have available. And so every census tract is different in terms of what's affordable. Area median income changes by census tract, but our state and federal definition is based on the county-wide area median income. So if we take the traditional route to define what is affordable, we'd be looking at households that earn less than 80% of the countywide area median income. But we've got to recognize that might be double what the median income is in that particular census tract. And then the flip side of that is, if the median income in a census tract is $20,000 or $25,000, we need to be very clear about where the subsidies are going to come from to achieve the level of affordability that we're trying to achieve. Not every site scores well for tax credits. Not every site is eligible for all of the programs that are out there. We need a lot more of those programs. And so there's always going to be this balance. So when you're advocating to your commissioners, recognize that you have to balance the number of additional housing units that you want in your neighborhood with the level of affordability, because either way, we're going to have to invest subsidy into the deal in order to make it affordable. And the question is, do we invest a lot of subsidy to get one really low income unit, or do we invest some subsidy to get several kind of moderate income units? And to be honest with you, I hate that that choice is put in front of us. But until we build up a larger war chest of funding in order to get more housing done, we have to make those kind of push-pull decisions.
Unfortunately, that's true. We've got a couple of questions here that circle back to an issue with regard to zoning. We're asked in one question about, are there areas of Grand Rapids that are being considered currently for rezoning for townhouses? Then we had another one that said something here. Off-street parking, which is a zoning requirement. Really? So that's another zoning issue. So I'm wondering, how do we impact zoning when we're talking about the development of affordable housing? I think that sounds like that's kind of an overriding question. How do we impact what's happening with zoning?
Yeah, I'm going to take this for a second, but other panelists jump in. So one of the things that we have to acknowledge is we're governed by state enabling legislation. And so the zoning ordinance has to be based on what the master plan says. And if the master plan doesn't call for dramatic changes, then it's very difficult for the planning commission to legally and justifiably make dramatic changes to the zoning ordinance. So that's why the city right now is engaged in a master plan update process so that they can take all of the feedback from the community, distill that into a plan, and then begin to support new zoning changes going forward. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities to make zoning adjustments sooner, like before the master plan is fully adopted. But the planning commission and planning staff have to be careful about not getting too far out in front of the master plan, because they can be faced with legal challenges. But I think the question of parking is a really critical one. Parking is one of those scarce commodities that none of us pay for generally. None of us pay for it directly out of pocket unless we're downtown, but it has a value and it has a cost. And so every time we require more off-street parking, we make it more difficult to build housing or just more expensive. And so the next time, again, when you're asked to provide input into what do you want to see in your neighborhood, if you say everybody's got to park on their own property and they can't park on the street because that's where I park, you need to understand that what you're doing is making it more expensive to build and limiting the amount of supply that can be built.
Sounds like I'm hearing a strong emphasis upon the development of this new master plan and an encouragement for involvement in the process, is what I think I'm hearing. I think I have pretty much hit the majority of our questions that have popped up for us. So I think we are a little early in finishing up. Panel, do any of you have any last things you'd like to say? Any last comments you'd like to leave us with before we close down for the evening? It's been an extraordinary experience for me to hear all of your insights and input about this unhoused phenomena that we're dealing with in our community. So I'm just really pleased and that you've all agreed to be part of this process and to speak your truth to this issue. Final thoughts from our panelists.
I would just like to thank everyone and thank you, Fran, for all of the work you put into pulling this together. Thank you very much.
You're here. Thank you, Fran.
All righty, guys.
I'd like to say the same thing. Thank you, Fran. Thank you for everybody for joining us. I think we had a great conversation and look forward to changes for the better in the future.
Fran, I don't know if we have time, but it does look like there was maybe one question that was
trying to get back in the chat to see that, and I couldn't get back in there.
Yeah,
Can you help me?
I am looking for it. Michelle, I believe that it says, Michelle, I hope this is the question you're referring to. So I've heard that we have approximately 5,000 nonprofits in our city. Given that, what progress has been made to increase housing stability?
If it's okay, I'll kind of jump in. And what I'd like to just share with you is something, it doesn't include 5,000 nonprofits yet, but we are building a coalition of partners on a shared network called the Gather Resources and Align Community Effort Network, which is a platform that is used to allow organizations across the community to make affordable housing a shared platform. So we have partners from healthcare, from education, from the workforce development area, from housing, all joining this network to be able to collaborate and share, deliver and receive referrals, and then track the longitudinal outcomes of those referrals so that we had system-wide community data about the impact of the work we are doing to address the social determinants of health in the community. So if anyone is more interested in that, please look up our website. There's a whole section on the GRACE network, and we'd love to have you learn more about why we think it's important to collaborate across sectors and how our partners are working together to make housing a shared priority.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you very much. I got another one here. Is there a short-term solution to the South Division homelessness issue, or is it just loitering? It's not. It's not just loitering. It's a much larger issue than simply loitering on the street. It really truly is. And I think that's the reason for this virtual event, so that we could kind of explore a bit more how much more involved this is than just people just hanging out because they just want to hang out. It's not that. It's much more.
Yeah,
it's much more involved.
Like I said in my presentation, a lot of those people that you assume are homeless and are just hanging out actually are not the problem. It's people who have homes and they're going down to pry on the homeless because they're vulnerable, whether it's to steal from them, to sell them drugs, or provide them alcohol or whatever. It's a population that is easily targeted, and the majority of those people that are loitering or causing the problems have a home that they're going to every night. So if we can reduce homelessness, we'll reduce loitering, but loitering is not the problem of the homelessness. It's what the effects of it are.
Okay, that's an interesting view on what's going on there. And thank you for that, Daniel. DSA Housing Group is attempting to put together a millage for affordable housing in I just lost it, it just bounced away from me. In 2022. If you're interested in assisting, all right, it's on our chat. If you're interested in assisting or would like to be an ally, contact Michelle Truskowski, and it's in the chat. I wanted to say one other thing, that yes, this is a recorded event, and the registrants will be given the link to the recording following our wrap up. I also want to say that I think that this might be the beginning of a discussion that some might want to continue. So what I'm going to do right now is put my email into the chat and ask anybody that would like to email me directly with their interest in continuing this conversation. Okay, here we go. And I think I'm going to say good night. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Brilliant, including
Thank you, everybody.
Twinkle fingers for Fran for bringing everybody together. Thank you, Fran.
It's been a pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you much. Good night, all.
Thank you.
Yeah, DP team, if you want to just stay on for a couple minutes. Let's wrap up.